Hello my friends, this is Lindy. You're watching Lindy's Magpie Reads and I am back from my travels. I will post more video from the trip, but right now I'm going to focus on books. Although I will say that two of the highlights of visiting my sister's farm in the Yukon were feeding bottle-fed lambs and going to the hot springs. We went twice. They're very close to my sister's farm and the facility is fantastic. Maybe I'll include a little bit about that at the end of this video. What did I do? Lots of reading, relaxing, and knitting. So that's my idea of a good holiday. I read 8 books in the last 10 days. 5 of those were audiobooks, and 2 of them were nonfiction, 2 were mystery/thrillers, and both of those were by Canadians, so that was part of my Shadow Giller project that is ongoing, and 2 of them were queer. So let's get to the books. First off, Murder Mystery, Mindful of Murder by Susan Juby. She is a Canadian author. She has written for adults before, the Woolfield Poultry Collective, and there was a sequel after that, but it's a book that's called something else in the US. I can't think of it offhand, but she's also written a lot for YA, including a book called Alice, I think, that was turned into a TV show. She's funny, thoughtful. This book, you might already have heard me talk about it a little bit because it was in my mid-year freakout for most recent favorite character, Helen, the Buddhist butler. So she was a Buddhist nun, left the nunnery to care for her mother who was dying, and then ended up working for this woman who runs a retreat center, which is modeled after Hollyhock, which is a famous retreat center on one of the Discovery Islands off the coast of British Columbia. And the woman who runs the retreat center dies under mysterious circumstances. And so Helen, who has just finished training to be a butler, is taking care of the things that her friend had asked her to do after she died, and happens to be investigating a murder at the same time. So, lots of fun. Not particularly literary, but definitely entertaining. So, I should tell you that I had a stack of 13 books to take with me on holidays, plus 3 little teeny tiny ones. And I knew that that was going to be too many, even for me. I did narrow it down to 4 books, plus 3 teeny tiny ones. And Mindful of Murder was one of them. And this was one of the teeny tiny books. You see, it's a novella, and it's written in verse. It's called Same Sexy Marriage, and it's by Julie Marie Wade. This book was gifted to me by Jenny Colvin. And if you know Jenny, I'm sure you know that she died in mid-May. She had a podcast, the Reading Envy podcast, that I was on many times as a guest. And I was due to be on again this summer. She's very much missed. Anyway, so I thought about her a lot when I read this book that she gave me. It is very tongue-in-cheek. So what's happening in this story is a mother who lives on the US West Coast has a daughter, an adult daughter who's a lesbian, and the mother does not want her friends to know that her daughter is a lesbian. So she makes up an imaginary husband and then imaginary child and children so that she can talk about her daughter and her friends won't know that she's a lesbian. So that's what's going on in here. It's funny and poignant, and I loved it. Thank you, Jenny. I also listened to so many audiobooks with my sister. My sister Zan was the driver for the whole way. It is 2,300 kilometers, the stretch between Edmonton and Fort Nelson, which is where we slept for the night. Is about an 11-hour drive, and then from Fort Nelson to Whitehorse is another 12 hours of driving, and the same in reverse coming home. Zan drove the entire way. I'm going to show you a little clip of her. Eyes on the road. The first book we listened to was all about the women from Greek myths. It's called Pandora's Jar, and it's by Natalie Haynes. She's a British classics scholar, and she's also a stand-up comic. I heard her interviewed on Writers and Company. Eleanor Wachtel is the interviewer, and the author is just so funny, and she narrates her own audiobook as well. So she talks about Medea and compares her to Beyonce seeking revenge. She talks about Helen of Troy, or is that Helen of Egypt? She talks about Medusa, whose hair was turned into snakes as a punishment for being raped. So yeah, Medusa was the one who was raped. She's the one who gets punished for it. Sound familiar? Yeah, there's so much relevancy to the way women are treated now. So Pandora's Jar, it's great. We also listened to Strange Beasts of China by Yan Ge. It's translated by Jeremy Tiang, and the audiobook is read by Emily Woo Zeller. Emily Woo Zeller is a star narrator. I trust anything that she narrates. Anyway, the Strange Beasts of China is one strange book. in a good way. It's interconnected stories that really come together at the end into a novel. And there's all these strange beasts, it's almost mythological creatures, and the narrator is a writer. She writes fiction for a newspaper, and she says there's an ironclad rule when you're writing fiction for newspapers, and that is never leave out the romance. Being a writer is kind of a shameful thing, apparently. Oh yeah, let's get to the strange beasts. So they might have, I don't know, a bone sticking out of their nose that catches the light. They might have gills or green skin around their belly button. But for each one, there's this repetition. Otherwise, they were no different from human beings. And there's definitely this underlying theme of acceptance of diversity, and the stylized storytelling actually really appealed to me. There's a lot of repetition. Sometimes there's an aspect of translation, like for example when she talked about some beasts that were exterminated by both being shot in the head and getting a lethal injection, belt and braces. And I don't know if that's an English version of a Chinese saying about overkill, wearing a belt as well as wearing braces, or if the translator chose a similar expression in English that would correlate to whatever the Chinese expression is. And I wish that I knew. I prefer to have, whatever the original saying was, and then I'll just make sense of it. But yeah, that's one of the curious things about translation. Anyway, dark, funny, recommended if that sounds like the sort of thing you'd like. And another Asian fantasy was one that's actually a children's audiobook, The Last Mapmaker, and it is by Christina Soontornvat. The audiobook is read by Sura Siu, and it is kind of like Thai-inspired fantasy with a 12-year-old girl as the main character. Very feisty. She sets off on adventure on a ship as the assistant to a map maker. And so one of the themes in this book has to do with exploitation of natural resources and how exploration and mapping can lead to unfortunate consequences, like over-exploitation of resources, for example. The author, by the way, is Thai-American, and she also wrote that fantastic nonfiction for kids book, All 13, which was about the cave rescue of the Thai boys soccer team. And I've read an earlier fantasy by her as well, called A Wish in the Dark. So yeah, recommend all three of these actually. Another audiobook that we listened to is a thriller by Linwood Barclay called Take Your Breath Away. Now, usually with a thriller, you've got cardboard characters because the main thing is the plot. You're reading it for the propulsiveness. And I would say in this case, their characters are not quite cardboard, but they're not exactly plausible either. Not always plausible anyway. But it was fun. It certainly made the miles go by. And one of the things was, so Linwood Barclay he's based in Canada. He is a long-time columnist for the Toronto Star. He's retired now. Still writes lots of books. But this novel is set in Connecticut, which is also where Barclay was born. And two of the friends in this book met at Yukon. And we listened to this as we were traveling towards the Yukon. So, my mind had to translate Yukon, University of Connecticut versus Yukon Territory, Canada. Just one of those things, And the final audiobook that we listened to is called Eating to Extinction. The subtitle is The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. And that is written by Dan Saladino, who is a food writer for the BBC, and he also narrates the audiobook. Now, this is one of those books that if you love fun facts and you want to share them with people, there are plenty in this book. Things like blood oranges. They were a spontaneous genetic mutation, and they started out around Mount Etna, and it's the hot days and cool nights that prompts anthocyanins to develop, and that gives the flesh and the skin the red color. Anthocyanins are the same compounds that make pomegranates red and blueberries blue. It's one of the fun things that I learned about in this book. When he was talking about milk, he said that the downward pressure on prices of milk in the UK, so between 2010 and 2014, the price of a liter of milk on average dropped about a third. And so it was cheaper to buy a liter of milk than a bottle of water. In the US, where a large dairy farm used to be around 200 cows, now these corporate dairies accommodate 9,000 animals. Almost all of these dairy cows around the world are one breed, Holstein. And that's the case for all of the main foods that we eat, where it's just one variety that's grown, like the Cavendish banana, one kind of wheat, one kind of rice. And so when there's a fungus or a disease that strikes, massive crops can be wiped out. So the genetic diversity is important, and we need to preserve species. This is the main thesis in the book. He says, there's a reason why monocultures do not occur in nature. And actually one of the quotes, I think it was in the cheese section, that I really liked. This was not Dan Saladino's quote, he was quoting somebody else, but he says, if you don't like bacteria, you are on the wrong planet. Yeah. And the best book that I read in the past 10 days is Chouette by Claire Oshetsky. Oh, what a fantastic, surreal, weird, bracing fable where a woman gives birth to a baby who seems to be an owl. And the father wants to do everything possible to medically intervene and make the child as normal as possible. Well, the mother is saying, what if Schuette doesn't need to be fixed? And, what if she's meant to be exactly the way that she is? So I really appreciated this look at motherhood and diversity. There's a bisexual subplot as well. It's funny, it's horrifying, and as I said, it's pretty weird. I really, really liked it. I loved it. Fraser Simons of Springboard Thought talked about it fairly recently on his channel. I'd heard about it prior to that, but listening to Fraser talk about it, I knew for sure I had to pick it up, and I am so glad that I did. So, if you have read any of these, please let me know in the comments, and I will see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.